Second speaker today is one of my colleagues, Dr. Pedro Urriola. He is an assistant professor in sustainable livestock systems at the University of Minnesota with appointments in animal science and veterinary population medicine. His research program integrates swine nutrition, health, and data-driven systems to promote environmental stewardship and production resilience. With over 100 peer-reviewed publications and more than $8 million in collaborative research funding, Dr. Urriola's work addresses practical challenges such as precision nutrition, decreasing the burden of disease, supply chain recovery of nutrients, and feed biosecurity. He applies systems thinking, life cycle assessment, and social science tools to evaluate feeding programs and health interventions within pork production. Through strong partnerships with veterinarians, producers, and feed companies, Dr. Urriola advances solutions that align with One Health principles and the evolving demands of the responsible pork production. Today, he is going to be receiving our Pijuan lectureship, and we actually do have an award for him. And just to remind you, Dr. Pijuan, this award is established in his honor for his work on swine diseases, and he was a professor at the University of Minnesota beginning in 1982, and was actually the founder of our Swine Disease Eradication Center. So this award is given in his honor to those that have a high degree of dedication to research and are recognized for their accomplishments in their area of research improving swine health. So I am happy to be able to relay this to him, and we'll hear more about his research for this. So thank you so much for being here, Pedro.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you for the introduction. Oh, sorry, this went off. And let's see if I can fix the pointer. 2 seconds. Okay, now we got it working. Morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for joining me in this Carlos Pijuan lectureship here at the Leman conference. I have been to this conference for about 20 years, and it's a real honor to be asked to deliver this talk. I came to Minnesota in 2004, and I was not Carlos' student, but I got the privilege, and I call that a privilege, to be a person mentee by Carlos. I got to join many times where Carlos was on teacher all the time. And whether you were in a lunch at his house or you were at the swine seminar, Carlos was always teaching. And I got to learn from Carlos that he had a vision always of the importance of not only understanding diseases, but understanding how production affect diseases or how diseases affect production. And those things that were look always in Carlos' mind back and forth, where sometimes we do things to treat the disease, but that thing that we have done to change production may change how the disease responds. And it's with also Carlos that I learned that training people was important because people were the ones making decisions on how they were going to deal with disease. So therefore we have production, we have the health, but also we have the person. And in that sense, I bring this vision today of Blind Man and the Pig. Blind Man is a story or a tale from around India, the region of India, where blind men are touching an elephant. And those blind men, they all think that they are perceiving is true. And I feel that and think that when we talk about sustainability, many times we are like the blind man touching the pig. We can think that we are touching part of the leg and we think this is a triangular shape, or we are touching the side and we think that it's a wall, or we are touching the ear and we think that it's a triangle. Whatever we touch, we think that is our true. And therefore, that must be what explains in the things that we want to implement are directed to what we see. So that brings to that idea that blind men, that we need to I think Carlos was a visionary in that sense, or a person that thought in this way in complex systems. The idea of complex system is because we produce pork, but we produce pork within a context. And that context or that multiple actors we are partly blind to the system. And so we have diverse actors, and that's the idea of we all are blind men. But there are also feedback loops, and there are these feedback loops change dynamically, they adapt. And we'll talk about topics today about adaptation. We'll talk about how these are changes and things can be dynamic, but also we'll talk about effects of multiple stages or multiple scales, where maybe we deem something beneficial at one scale, for example, at the barn scale, but that may not be what is beneficial for the entire system. And to the figure on my right is what I used to tell what we do in my lab. In my lab, we talk about sustainability, but when I think about sustainability, I don't only think about sustainability within the realm of manure, land, and pigs. I try to think beyond that in a more expansive way, because we also need to think of what is the goal that we are trying to do with the system. What is that we are trying to accomplish? What is the context? And part of that context, for example, is biofuels, right? We are gearing to produce more soybeans, to crush more soybeans. Well, that may have some impact on what I do or how I see, and what are the things that I have to be working with. But also we have changes in culture, and we change in people's desires for care for the environment and or different perspectives. Therefore, when I talk about sustainability, I use this picture to think of a bigger picture of what we think that we are working on. So as we describe the system, it is useful to think of patterns and things that are useful to recognize as we do the studies in systems and study, in this case, pork production. We talk about first the blind man, and that's a different perspective, right? But we also talk about circularity, right? How manure is a nutrient that can be used to produce crops, to produce back food. But we also have circularity in the sense that we have feedback mechanisms. Sometimes we try to do something that brings a second activity or a consequence, and that consequence may change back the system and the way we interact. The next one is time delays and non-linear responses, and this we will see more as, for example, as we feed animals, sometimes we think that they will react in one way, and maybe what we measure is more dynamic than we initially thought. And that there are always trade-offs and leverage points. And these two are important also because they help us to understand that pretty much there is no free lunch. And for more that we think that I will introduce something to help do something better, well, but there may be always a consequence. So there may be something else that is going to change in the system that we need to be aware of. And leverage points, and this is the idea that if we want to make changes in the system, we need to find elements or portions of that system where that change would be more effective to be introduced at. But we're talking about sustainability, right? And a lot of times when I talk to my colleagues in my lab is, what is it that we are trying to sustain? What is that we need to sustain? I come from Venezuela, and in Venezuela, we, this actually the picture of my parents' farm back in Venezuela. We used to have 500 sows, and we don't have those anymore. You can see that this is just the skeleton, the bare bones of what was the concrete, the pits. And for me and my parents, as I was growing, I always wanted to have the farm. I wanted to continue to be working in that farm. So when you define sustainability for many farmers, and you go and talk to farmers here in the US, they will tell you, we are stewards of the land. We are not going to be doing anything that will harm the ability of my kids, my grandkids, to use that same land. And that was the same sentiment that I have as a Venezuelan working there. The situation changed, the country changed, there were other opportunities for me and my brother. Well, we left the country, and therefore, Why that farm may not have been sustainable was not because we didn't have a manure management plan. There may be other reasons. There were other reasons why not. And so it is important also when we think about sustainability to have the ability for producers to continue to do what they need to do as stewards of the land. And we need to recognize that the next generation needs to be trained also or need to learn. This is our daughter Abigail, and thanks to farmers that help us bring her to their farm and try to teach the things that Maria and I get happy to do. And when we talk about sustainability, then, well, we talk about many things like carbon neutral, regenerative agriculture, circularity, and it seems that we are building a tower of ideas and concepts that, yes, maybe something that looks sustainable, but we don't know because we don't have anything to measure that sustainability. So I take sustainability. There is a report where this idea of sustainability was generated in the United Nations, Our Common Future, and they define sustainability as meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations of meeting their own needs. And see that I highlight the word needs. I'm a swine nutritionist, and so actually I'm veterinarian, first in Venezuela and then swine nutritionist. And in that nutrition mindset, I always think that, well, what we need to do is provide food for people. And none of the colleagues here in the group will take a diet for a pig and formulate and balance that diet on crude protein basis. We don't do that for pigs. Yet for humans, when we compare plant-based versus animal-based proteins, we do it on a protein basis, when in fact maybe we should be doing that using the dietary indispensable amino acid score, which is very similar to, say, the ileal digestibility. And why do I think that is important? Well, because when we compare plant-based food versus animal food on a digestible lysine basis, so this is the amount of lysine that is delivered in that food per or the CO2 equivalents, the measurement of GSG or environmental gases per unit of digestible lysine that food is delivering. And that's where we see that foods are more comparable on a standard basis, because what we are producing, yes, you may be producing pork. No, you may be producing nourishment for people that is, today we know that measurement, the better measurement of that nourishment is digestible amino acids. Therefore, I define that sustainability as meeting the needs of digestible amino acids of the population without compromising the ability of future generations of meeting their own needs. These titles, and you can find more resources in these magazines and from the Society of Animal Sciences. But it seems that this is not what the public is seeing and what they are listening to. So this is a survey from our college at the University of Minnesota, and yes, people still consume animal-derived proteins. However, younger generations are very open to consume alternative sources of protein because of the idea that they are more sustainable, that they will be better produced. However, this sounds like a dichotomy, right? A dichotomy. Animal-based versus plant-based proteins, right? It sounds like two opposite things, and we should fight against plant-based proteins, right, in the defense of animal-based proteins. But as a matter of fact, the same companies that are investing in producing pork are those ones that are investing in producing plant-based protein because it's a growing market, and they want also a piece of that pie, right? And therefore, it is important for us to break out of that dichotomy and say, let's move forward with something else. This is what I think could be something else. Well, circularity. I mentioned to you that there are things that are waste byproducts or byproducts or alternative ingredients that are produced at one section of the system that we need to take in the next set of the system. This is a survey from the American Feed Industry Association, and they look at, based on a definition of circular feed ingredients, what are those ingredients that are considered a waste of one industry and that can be used in another industry, right? So that we are doing a circle within the system. Well, pork, we are not as high as or compared to other industries. Can we do better? Will that be better for us? Well, it is something that we need to continue to think of. What benefit would there be for us? Whenever I think of using a waste from another industry to producing pork, I always think, what will be the benefit? Why would I try to convince a pork producer to add this stuff into a pig diet? And basically, most of the time, if it's in the base of energy or amino acids, well, we have corn and soybeans in North America. Our European colleagues is a different story. Or if you go to Venezuela or Ecuador, well, sometimes we have dynamics of ingredients availability, so it becomes something different. But in the US, in the Midwest, with corn and soy, we need to find some other beneficial effect that protein or that fiber or that bioactive compound is going to have on animal health. And therefore, I continue to collaborate with the Integrated Animal Systems Biology Group. We use omics techniques, metabolomics, and microbiome primarily to try to understand what will be the impact of that dietary fiber on elements like gut health. How can those components that are waste in some other industry can be made into something useful to feed pigs? Therefore, we move away from that dichotomy used by products, and now we have something that is of value that we are feeding the animal. Well, how do we find that value? How do we know that whenever we are going to feed something to the pig is a value to them? Well, that is the nutritional evaluation that is something that I grew up working or we always work. So we have now an element that we're going to feed to the animal, and that's the second objective of my lab. Then to understand what is the nutritional value of different ingredients, but also what does the animal need? How do I care better for the animal, and what is that we need to give the animal? And whenever I produce that food or that feed ingredient, what is that carbon footprint of that feed ingredient? As I mentioned that we are stewards of the land and we need to be proud on how we have fed humankind, we also need to recognize that there are problems, for example, losses of nitrogen to the environment that are causing increase in nitrates concentration in waterways and wells and rivers. And therefore, that's maybe not only a problem of pork. I understand that's a problem as much as a pork as a biofuels, right? But we want to do our part. You may have heard recently how, for example, EPA was relaxing some regulations on nutrients in wastewater from packing plants. And again, another dichotomy. If I'm in environmentally groups, I would say the EPA are to relax, and if I'm a packer, I would say thank you EPA because that was a rule that was not helpful. But instead of one versus the other, if we expand our mind, if we think on systems, we'll realize that there may be other areas of opportunity and those what we call leverage points, right? Where we can have a better bang for our buck, so to say. And that is, I'm not an agronomist and will not talk about this portion, but for sure cover crops and other techniques exist and are available, and we should work towards that implementation, but we figure out to talk a little more of what we can do within the barn setting. So what can we do? Well, traditionally, we have thought of, I will feed that animal right at the requirement. Whatever is that what the animal needs, I will supply that requirement to the animal so that I minimize excretion of nutrients. Make sense? Okay, and that's the work that I was trained on to do and how I always thought about it. And we use for that, let's say, how do I find what the animal needs? Well, I will feed something at incremental levels to a group of pigs, right? And many of you have research barns and may have done this work in your own research barns. You feed increasing levels of something and you measure, for example, response like growth of pigs in the pen or nitrogen retention, right? And as the animal retains more nitrogen, it means that it's growing, right? And as they reach a plateau, they don't grow anymore, Therefore, whatever I feed past this point is waste. Therefore, we check this one as being the requirement, and I'm in the NRC committee, and this is pretty much what we tend to do, say, okay, that's the requirement, and this is what the animal should be consuming. Well, this technique was developed a long time ago, and my colleague Christian Ramirez Camba spoke on Saturday at the workshop and said, you know what, guys, computing power has changed. We can do different things today that we were not able to do in the past. Previously, we had to assume a plateau. But when Christian looks at the data and says, well, maybe there is not always a plateau. There are nonlinear responses that are important for us to recognize. And he developed what is called the log linear model. In this log linear model, we have two inflections. We see the increase, as you're looking at. Then there is a first inflection of protein deposition, so it reaches an increase. And then there is a second point, a second inflection. And Christian has observed that in that second inflection, there are many things associated to improve health to the sow. And this was primarily developed first in sows, but we have seen these patterns also in growing pigs and in other species of animals. Therefore, that idea that there was a plateau is something that was useful at the time, but maybe not useful anymore. And what information can we get if we look beyond that point? Well, these are data from 28 experiments that Christian compiled, and then observed that, yes, when he fits that log linear model, he can see the pattern, and he can see that here at protein deposition, total pig-borns decrease, but at reproduction potential maximum, he called, well, there is a second inflection point, or where that point is maximized. Traditionally, we would have called this one the requirement. Now we are thinking, well, maybe you want to think of what you want to do, maybe a higher level, maybe better, maybe more necessarily. And in the development of evaluation of new models, we have different stages. The first stage that I was explaining is take data, bring an idea, take the data, create a model, but you don't know that model is true or not, or how does it apply. And therefore, Christian went, used data from the literature and test his model against data in the literature. And the next step is testing more refined against papers that have used that same idea that we had, or a similar nutrient requirement experiment. And in this one, then, he looked at sows that, for example, were fed different levels of lysine during gestation, and look at not only the productivity of the sow, but in this case, retention of sows in the herd. And he calculated at this point is the protein deposition maximum, so we would have called this one traditionally the requirement, where nitrogen deposition of that sow was maximum. Well, but if I feed past that level, it seems that I see in this paper, using the data from this past paper, a decrease in the number of cold sows. Well, then maybe part of the issues that we have with mortality could be derived, and I'm not saying that we know that yet, but it's our hypothesis whether part of that increase in mortality that we have is that because we were misinterpreting what is the requirement. Or maybe because there is no requirement. Actually, the idea of a requirement is something that we want to change. There are responses of animals to nutrients, and when I feed the animal at this level, I get one response. When I feed at this other level, I get another response. Make sense so far? Okay. Well, we went to feed sows in our farm in Huasica, and that's what we are doing right now. And we are looking at a broad range in lysine intake. And this is an important point to bring, because many times we want to use tools like machine learning or other data analysis tools, but we forget that in many cases our farms don't vary too much. If you take data from today's farms, they will be fitting somewhere around the NRC requirement, because that's logical for us to do, right? And we are not making changes in the system. Make sense so far? And I think this concept is important, so I'm going to use another analogy to see if you see it. Let's say I had a slinky in my hand. Everybody knows what a slinky is, right? A thing that is in a spiral, right? And I pull the slinky and it will come back, right? Well, I wouldn't be able to tell what the slinky is going to do if I don't pull it. Make sense? Therefore, in many of our farms, if everybody's feeding at the requirement, or if we are using space allocation for pigs in the growing that is within a narrow range, no matter what machine learning I use, I don't have the data to see beyond that point. And therefore, we need to create systems for us to tell, to pull the slinky somehow to understand how the system is going to respond. And therefore, we are doing these experiments in our farms in Waseca. Now, today, we don't have the data, for example, on sow retention. It's something that it will take us more time to deliver. But I want to also point to another point, or show another point, that nonlinear response. Because now we have multiple outcome variables. We have multiple things that we're measuring. So sometimes we say, oh, I want to see total number of pigs born, mortality of the piglets. I want to see improvements in sow retention. But also I have multiple amino acids that I can be feeding that can have an impact on that health of the animals. And traditionally, we have used something called the ideal amino acid concept that was developed at the University of Illinois many years ago, and it was very useful and very operational. But we, for many years, have known that amino acids have other functions, and we have called those ones functional amino acids when the animal are in sort of stress, like subclinical infections with diseases or vaccinations and immune challenges. We see animals benefiting or pigs benefiting from those other amino acids. But imagine that you will have to do experiment after experiment, look at that broken line analysis or whatever that new tool you want to use, whether a log linear model, for each amino acid in each experiment. Will take you forever. Well, Christian has used machine learning techniques to understand data from the literature and see if he can pick what are the amino acids that have association with some other traits. In this case, in the first one is growth of the animal, but here we have gut health or immunity. And with this tool, what we are trying to look is, can we tell what is the association with a amino acid to the more desired outcome that is beyond growth of the animal that can be associated with other health benefits to the animal. Because in many cases, we emphasize and we make a lot of focus on we need to improve the health of the animal by removing the pathogen. And I know that you're doing a good job of trying to remove the pathogen, but in many cases you won't be able to. And therefore, I think we need to also make sure that we prepare the host, because disease is a host and a pathogen interaction. And we always need to remember we need to make the animal, the host, more resilient. Perhaps, sure, I have my bias, I'm a nutritionist, perhaps by better nutrition of amino acids, and machine learning could be one of these techniques that can help us pick up what are those amino acids. But in itself, what these new techniques are also helping us is to change the way we think about the problem too. When I learned about nutrition, I understood or learned about the hierarchy of nutrients. Well, we feed animals, and as I keep feeding the animal higher levels of, let's say, protein or amino acids, that animal is growing well, and reproducing. And if I measure things like total pig born, I will say that if a diet maximizes total pig borns, maybe that animal have covered all the maintenance requirements, and therefore, something that increases total number of pig borns has covered the maintenance requirement of the animal. But now we think that maybe that's more modular, where there are negotiable and non-negotiable maintenance requirements. And sometimes the animal, the sow, can make the decision of putting more nutrients toward a litter and increase the number of total born at perhaps longevity of the sow. And that's why we think that maybe those ideas are changing in us in the way we think. So these are mental maps, things that help us to think about the problem beyond, and by listening to the data, or I say listening to the data, to understanding what the data are telling us and using new tools. Brings me to a point that back in 2004, 2003, Dr. Pilluan was talking about. We're talking about how can we get different data and how we can think differently, because if we want to make pork production more sustainable, we need to make some changes of the practice that we do on how we analyze information. Well, Dr. Pilluan was talking on how our competitive model have produced information, but sometimes fewer solutions. And also to try to think of who is our competitor. And yesterday we heard a little bit about maybe sometimes we need to, for the improvement of the entire industry, we need to be maybe more demand-driven, or how then maybe sustainability is an area that is pretty competitive, that we need to realize that we need to work together in doing new work. And when it's to develop information or bring information back to producers, used to be different than what we have today. And last year, Dr. Tokat spoke here at the Leman conference too on how research has evolved for our industry. And maybe not a concern, but a reality, less of that research sees the light, right? And sometimes we have it in our own files. I understand how difficult it's to go and write a paper, not alone do the research, right? So less information is seeing the light, and more of that information maybe is in the hands of the private sector. Not bad or good. What I'm saying is that if we need to make changes and we need to continue to make improvement, we'll need information. Both Dr. Pilluan and Dr. Tokat spoke about the need to carefully testing and using models that help us test whatever is that direction that we want to go. And therefore, I bring this analogy. Maybe a pork production system that is more competitive and more sustainable, more sustainable. As a nutritionist, I think that is that system that improves feed efficiency, that takes feed and then produce pork. But maybe a system is one that takes information and transforms that into solution. And therefore, maybe what we need to think of more sustainable is that ability to take information and create solutions and create change. Because a lot of the things that are reported in the literature as sustainable are dependent on improving efficiency. And I think efficiency is a paradox. A paradox meaning that it can be helpful, but I don't know it's always, right? There is a good literature review from Kansas State University published recently, and other from my colleague, Dr. Jerry Shurson. And they make review of all the technologies, all the things that are available to us to improve sustainability. And 99% of those techniques are dependent on efficiency, making efficiency, and at the barn level especially. Well, back in 2012, Dr. John Patient spoke at this same conference and spoke about feed efficiency. And he brought a quote from a nutritionist called Dr. Steve Pollman. And Dr. Pollman said, with numbers at that time, that a 1% change in feed efficiency was equivalent to $31 million. Therefore, something that we want. But Dr. Pollman always said, feed efficiency is a dangerous production target when viewed in isolation. And I want to make this similar analogy where when we view efficiencies in isolation, maybe a dangerous target for us for sustainable pork production. And this is one example. There may be others that you can think about. For example, at the barn level, at a group of pigs, I can feed them diets with low protein or diets with reduced levels of distillers grains or no distillers grains and make them more efficient. But that may not be the efficiency for the system, right? Because if we are going to produce more biofuels and those products are produced, then what is the goal? The goal may be for us to be an agriculturist, to think about ourselves not only as a pork producer, but we are delivering to society biofuels and maybe pork alongside. Therefore, we collaborate with the group in the Institute of the Environment. In this group, we are using precision estimates of the environmental impact of producing crops in different areas of the United States. And this food cubes model, what helps us is to understand now what is the environmental impact of producing crops at the different regions, and can we have a regional calculations of efficiencies. But again, I want to emphasize this point. every time I think about sustainability, I think about efficiencies. And it seems to me it's similar to the triangle that is in this picture. No matter how much I try to tell you that there is no triangle there, you see a white triangle. Everybody sees the white triangle, right? But there's no white triangle, but we all see it, right? And it's because true is something, and I need to read this one. We need to remember that what we observe is not nature in itself, but nature exposed to our method of questioning. So the tools that we have used to understand what the animal requires, or what is environmental impact, or what is that we need to deliver, sometimes are delivering us a story that is very, very different from what it is. And therefore, maybe that makes us think that efficiency will be useful. Well, we need to be careful that not always. So we're talking about tools and how we change that paradigm, how we try to think in a different way. If I tell you this triangle, the way that for you to see is that there is no line here, no line here, right? You're going step by step, rationalizing that. Well, if I tell you, for example, that average pigs, or taking the average of an experiment and trying to tell what the animal needs because the average animal in that group grew better, maybe is incorrect. We have developed in the lab this agent-based model that helps students think and play with the data to realize by themselves, to do that work of going step by step, and observe that maybe, depending on the rules that you put in this game, that you will see increased mortality. And therefore, at the average level, animal level, you see improvements and you will think that A is better, but at the population level, maybe B is better because we have less mortality. So the tool that we were using needs to change for us to understand what is that we need to do. The final element that we are doing in my lab is to work with decreasing the burden of infectious and non-infectious diseases. And when I talk about diseases, is in general infectious and non-infectious diseases. Now, the first work that we have done is to work on infectious diseases. In this work with Shelby Kreb, Shelby has looked with Maria into what is the impact of animals, sick animals, what is the environmental impact of pigs sick with Mycoplasma pneumonia. And as they look at data from the literature and calculated the environmental impact of producing 1,000 pounds of, or 1,000 kilograms of pork in terms of global warming potential. And this is from animals that are healthy, and then as animals get low, medium, or severe disease, we see that environmental impact in terms, in this case, of global warming potential being increasing. And we did this by using feed, the amount of feed need to deliver to the animals to get to a target body weight. We also know that there are other diseases and things that affect the animals that are maybe not infectious, but an inability of the animal to cope with the environment to the type of farms that we've designed. And those ones are, for example, low birth weight piglets. Data from us and from other colleagues, every pig that is born below 1 kilogram of body weight has a higher mortality. And yes, maybe with genetics we'll try to correct some of that, but not all. And it will be important to produce tools and decrease that mortality of the newborn pigs that are of light body weight. But not only they die more, they take longer to get to market. Therefore, if we want to improve sustainability of pork production, we need to help these animals be more productive or be of better food value. Well, we have used zinc oxide or zinc sulfate, in late gestation in the diets of sows, right? And maybe a past student from the University of Minnesota may be here and tell you more about that. And on Saturday, Dr. Lee Johnston presents some of this data. We have also used zinc in other stages in production. For example, in nursery pigs at weaning to decrease post-weaning diarrhea. 3,000 ppm or 2,000 ppm is a very common practice. Well, the problem is that that additional zinc, the animal will not retain, will go into manure, and that additional zinc will accumulate in the environment. And in that, in a motivation to be careful, the European Union put a ban on the use of high levels of zinc oxide in the diet of nursery pigs, right? Well, one idea that is always observed in systems is that there are unintended consequences, that idea that there is no free lunch. What did they observe in the European Union? Well, after some time delay, they observed an increase in the total use of antibiotics. So one work that my colleague Jin-Soo Hong, now he's an assistant professor at Purdue University, who was a postdoc with me, and Jin-Soo and I talking, said, well, Jin-Soo, what if the gains in productivity that we get from using zinc oxide offset the losses, right? Or the additional investment that I did in using zinc oxide, the animal becomes more productive, and therefore I dilute that environmental impact. So we did an experiment with 3 levels of zinc oxide in the diets of nursery pigs, and we look at growth and health of the piglets, and yes, that growth and health improves, and this is very well described in the literature. And then we calculate the carbon footprint of producing a pound of pork. And yes, because you are producing more pork, you are diluting that total environmental footprint, right? So therefore, if our goal was to go and produce pork of a lower environmental footprint, well, using zinc oxide continues to make sense. Now, as I mentioned, that zinc will be excreted into the environment and cause what here in this life cycle analysis we determine as being ecotoxicity. And that ecotoxicity did increase, so we have trade-off in these regards. And so therefore, there is no simple solution. We need to work on what is that the goals that we want to reach. So in thinking on systems, and I asked permission yesterday from Dr. Minion, because as he was talking, and I've been learning about sustainability and pork production, I always got introduced to the idea of thinking in systems. And maybe whether he knew or not, I think that he described a pattern that is, or an idea that is fundamental to system thinking, and is that of feedback loops. He was talking on how sometimes we are stuck in this loop, in this dilemma, that we try to do something and that something comes to another. Typically, we think more linearly, right? I have a disease, I have diagnosed the disease, I treat it, and then resolve. But actually, it's maybe something more linear where we have things that I try to do more something, and that something brings me to something else that puts me to do more of that or something else. And in systems, those are called feedback loops. And I think that exemplifies the change in mindset that we may need to have. Therefore, in that regard, in my laboratory, also we have a sociologist working with us, because we recognize that in this we call wicked problems, right? Some things about the environment, I can tell you all the science, I can make all the calculations, and this is how much zinc is going to decrease the growth of the pig, or how eradication of the disease is going to help, or how changes in the diet of the animal are going to help the animal grow better. But a lot of those problems also is what we value as society, right? And therefore, maybe the response is not always only one scientific calculation. It's something that we need to understand what are the values. We have developed this multi-domain framework on sustainable pork production. This framework has 3 main components. One is we have operational inputs, and this is what typically we can control. But we need to make sure that whatever measurements we do have the animal at the center. And many times I regard myself as an animal nutritionist and veterinarian, that I care for the animal, but maybe sometimes not. In many of our experiments, we don't measure sufficiently things that can tell us what is the status of the animal. In that idea that I was mentioning before on how feeding the sow to the requirement maximizes her protein deposition, but maybe retention in the herd is decreasing. So sometimes the animal may not be completely at the center of our calculations. But there are contextual constraints. I was talking about how maybe pork production is connected to biofuel production, and therefore we need to understand that nutrition or the things that we do for sustainable pork production are within a context. And therefore, we believe that this framework will help us all think. I hope to use it with my students, but also publish and use it that you can use for you to think beyond traditional ways of thinking about the problems. And that brings me to the conclusions. The blind man and the pigs is that analogy for our fragmented view of the system, right? The happiness framework is something that we think is holistic and will help us to have that system-based thinking to understand and integrate multiple aspects of our overlooked perspective. System thinking and modeling will allow us to move beyond dichotomies and reflect about complexity. And this, I think, will help us because many times when consumers are pinning us against something, we shouldn't be just pinned out against the wall. We need to think that it's more complex, and that complexity is not an excuse, is an important first step to recognize that there may be more solutions to the problem that sometimes is intended to be presented. But we talk about transdisciplinary teams that are, I think then when we couple a transdisciplinary team with a data-driven method, those will be essentials to deliver sustained improvement to pork production. I want to acknowledge this is the work, not only mine, but for many colleagues that I always have the pleasure to learn from. And finally, I want to leave you with a thought. Many of you may have gone to an ASV where Carlos woke you up at 5 a.m. to go bird watching. Anybody? Right? And Carlos, it would be hard to say what Carlos would do for me, for example, right? He was a free spirit. However, I will say that Carlos would be a person that would be in favor of making sure that we need to continue to improve the environment. Not only making sure that we defend ourselves against environmental groups, but we need to make sure that we do things that improve the environment, that allow us to have more opportunities to take pictures like that. Those are not my pictures because Carlos were always complaining that I was a poor picture taker. Thank you, Monsi, for the pictures because Carlos was a good picture taker. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pedro, for that talk. Once again, questions can be texted to the phone number on the screen, which will be there shortly, and we'll field questions in that way. I'm going to start with kind of a general question, and I really like the analogy of the blind man and the pig for sustainability. And I was wondering what, in the public's perception of what they think about sustainable animal production, animal-based agriculture, what do you think the biggest misconception is, and how would you think that the would be most beneficial in improving the public's perception of sustainability in pork production?
Yeah, you know, since I've been in this job, I always reflect that what is that we need to tell the public, but I continue to change my mind, and actually, you know, and like me, in that question, there is the idea, what is the misperception, right? But the public are blinded the same way as we are blinded, and therefore, what they perceive is true to them too, right? And I want to sell them pork. Therefore, I don't want to categorize what they see as a misperception. What I want to categorize is that what they see is true to them and what I see is true to me. And therefore, so the first point is, it's not a misperception, right? They are true on what they are observing. Most of them, for what I gather, they care about the environment. People would like to make better for the environment. They wouldn't pay for it. And therefore, it's part of the issues that we have. Make sense?
Right, thank you. Okay, so does the sow parity have an effect on the dynamic response to nutrient supply?
Yes, that's a good question. Yes, traditionally, for example, gills will be still depositing muscle and growing, so we need to take that part of into the account. So far, with the experiments that we have done, we have multiple parity sows in our experiment, and we are working in evaluating that data. And good, because our herd at the university, actually, we have sows with parity 9 and parity 11. That may not be what you have, but actually that's something that perhaps will allow us to understand a broader range.
All right, so this is a longer question. So you talked about efficiency, and particularly feed efficiency. So the speaker yesterday, Luke Minion, talked about the need to increase pork demand, and to do so, we may need animals that are more fatty so that pork is tastier. So the question is, do we need animals that are less efficient and more fatty? And would that challenge the concept of sustainability as we know it today?
Yes, a very good question. And yes, when I heard the speaker yesterday and reflect on that, when we think about efficiency, what is something that we can do to improve efficiency in the pig from a nutrition standpoint? Maximize lean accretion, maximize lean, because as the animal deposits muscle, that muscle has water, and that weighs more, right? That makes it very efficient. However, and if we think that more sustainable means more efficiency, it will only make sense to do that. And we'll be in that feedback loop, right? More efficiency, a more linear animal is more efficient, therefore I want to do that more of that. But if we change the goal and we change what the outcome should be, an unintended consequence of that increase in leanness is making the system maybe less sustainable because consumer will desire to consume less of that pork. And therefore, that idea that efficiency is something, that's why I showed you the triangle, because I think something that we need to escape from and make sure that we need to see what is our goal. There may be markets where more lean and more pork and more throughput will be good, some other markets are not, or some conditions, and we need to understand that complexity.
I was also had the opportunity to sit in the policy session yesterday, and there was a discussion, very nice speaker on MAHA, which is Make American Healthy Again, with potential new nutrition guidelines. And I was just wondering if you could comment. You talked about amino acids and available and digestible, and that as a measure of how healthy or how we should think about protein. And I was wondering if you could comment at all about some of the work that you do and how it really would relate in concepts of nutrition and nutrition guidelines.
Well, I'm a swine nutritionist, veterinarian swine nutritionist, so not a policymaker or not a human nutritionist, but I do believe that animals and pigs especially are usually used as a good model for human nutrition because we have similarities in our gastrointestinal tract. And in many, not my lab, but many other labs, Dr. Dilger was yesterday here, for example, they use pigs as models. Yes, it is true that many of our nutritional models, especially with energy, tend to overlook the effect of how the food is being delivered to the animal, whether it's small particle size or pre-processed. So there is some truth that because the MAHA, one of the movements is to decrease, for example, what they call ultra-processed foods. And yes, if you were to look at the systems that we developed to understand how many calories there is in food, sometimes those tools that we have underestimate the amount of energy that we can get from those ultra-processed food or something that has been pre-processed. Therefore, for whole grains, and will be easier for us to control, for example, calorie intake, especially for me. So, therefore, yes, there is some reality, or in that case, to those blind men, the perception that decreasing ultra-processed food would be important. However, it's also a problem because what is an ultra-processed food and in what context, right? And therefore, is the ham that I was eating last night in my sandwich ultra-processed or not? And when we start to evaluate what is ultra-processed or not, we'll find that we have the same problems that we are creating. So I think that yes, they see one reality, but I think that we need to be careful because implementation of those ideas could be as dangerous. We still need to make sure that we have protein. We still have population of people that have low protein intake, and therefore it will be important for us to, and it's a complex issue. I had a colleague in food science and nutrition, and his seminars, he will put cookies at the end of the seminar, right? And then everybody will sit down, everybody will talk, and he starts his talk. And we're talking about control of food intake. And his first question is, why did you take the cookie? And he was like, I don't know. It was seminar, 3 p.m., and were you hungry? No, I wasn't, right? And that's complexity of the system. Why? And therefore, I think that what we need to transmit to this group in MAHAF, and not intend to be political, but things are more complicated. Simple solutions are not always what we need.
All right, one last question for you. Considering the complexity of sustainability, is there a good metric to compare gains or evaluate improvements, or do we just have blind men with their own measuring sticks?
It's a good question. Yes, I believe so far that what you call that tool, right? What is that outcome that you want to measure depends on your values. And therefore, there may not be one single thing because I cannot impose my values on Kim's, right, or vice versa. Therefore, what that measuring stick may change a little bit. Ideally, we'll also have a similar ruler, right? And therefore, we can talk to each other and communicate. And I think that systems thinking is one of those frameworks that help us to communicate and have similar tools to measure whether we are making improvement towards certain goals. But yes, there is no one size fits all. It depends on what are the values.
All right, with that, let's thank both our speakers again, and thank you, Pedro, for the enlightening talk about sustainability.